3 days after her husband died in battle, Margaret opened a letter that changed everything. She didn't know he was gone yet. The telegram hadn't arrived. So when she saw his handwriting on that envelope, her heart did what it always did. It leapt. She thought he was safe. But the letter began with 5 words that made her hands shake. If you're reading this, something's happened. He sat in the darkness, flashlight trembling in one hand, pencil in the other. He knew what was coming. They all did. So he started writing. Not a goodbye. He couldn't bear that. But something else. Something that would reach her even if he couldn't. "My dearest Margaret," he began. And for the next hour, he poured everything into those pages. Every memory, every promise, every reason he had for fighting. He sealed it, handed it to the chaplain with one instruction: "Only if I don't make it back." Then he went to war. What he wrote in that letter, and what it meant when she finally opened it, is a story about love in the darkest of times. This is that story. My dearest Margaret, do you remember the day we met? I think about it all the time. Spring of 1940. That church social at St. Mary's where your aunt dragged you because she said you needed to meet people. You were wearing that yellow dress, the one you said was too bright, but I thought made you look like sunshine itself. You were standing by the lemonade table, being polite to Mrs. Henderson, who was telling you some long story about her garden. And I was across the room, pretending to be interested in Tommy's joke, while really just watching you. Tommy knew. He always knew. He elbowed me in the ribs and said, "Either go talk to her or stop staring like a lost puppy." I told him I wasn't staring. He told me I was a terrible liar. So I walked over. My hands were sweating. My collar felt too tight. And when I opened my mouth to introduce myself, I forgot my own name for a second. Just stood there like an idiot while you looked at me with those green eyes that I'd spend the rest of my life trying to describe in letters. You know what you did? You smiled. Not a polite smile, but a real one. And you said, "You're James, aren't you? Your mother shops at O'Malley's grocery." She talks about you all the time. I felt so relieved that you knew who I was, I almost forgot to ask you to dance, but I did ask. And you said yes. And we danced to some song I can't even remember now, because all I could focus on was the fact that you let me hold your hand, and you laughed at something I said, and you didn't seem to mind that I stepped on your foot twice. When the song ended, you looked up at me and said, "James Callahan, I think you should ask me to dinner sometime." And I said, "Tomorrow?" And you said, "Tomorrow would be perfect." That dinner, Maggie. Do you remember? I took you to Patterson's Diner on Main Street. You ordered the chicken pot pie and I got the meatloaf, and we talked for 3 hours until the owner started giving us looks because he wanted to close up. You told me about teaching, about how you'd wanted to be a teacher since you were 8 years old when Miss Cooper let you help grade spelling tests, about how you loved that moment when a child's face lights up because they finally understand something they'd been struggling with. I told you about the hardware store, about how I knew it wasn't glamorous, but I liked helping people fix things. Like that moment when someone comes in frustrated because their sink won't stop dripping, and you find them the right washer, and they leave happy. You didn't laugh at that. Some girls might have, but you looked at me like I'd said something profound, and you said, "That's because you care about people, James. That matters more than glamour." I walked you home that night. It was a warm evening and the fireflies were just starting to come out. We took the long way, down by Miller's Creek, and you told me about your family. About your mother who loved to sing but couldn't carry a tune. About your father who worked for the railroad and brought you back souvenirs from different cities. About your little sister who was boy crazy and drove you insane. When we got to your aunt's house, I didn't want the night to end. So I asked if I could see you again. You pretended to think about it, tapped your finger on your chin like you were considering something very serious. And then you smiled and said, "I suppose I could make time for you, James Callahan. But only if you promise to improve your dancing." I saw you every day for the next 2 weeks. Every single day. We'd meet after you finished teaching, and we'd walk, or sit in the park, or go to the pictures. You were only supposed to be visiting your aunt for the summer, but you kept extending your stay. 1 more week, Then another. Then another. By the time August rolled around, I knew I couldn't let you leave. I proposed on a Tuesday. Nothing fancy, nothing planned. We were sitting on your aunt's porch swing, and you were reading poetry out loud. Whitman, I think. And the way the evening light caught your hair, the way your voice sounded saying those words, the way you looked so perfectly content just being there with me. I interrupted you mid-verse and said, "Maggie, will you marry me?" You stopped reading, looked at me like you weren't sure you'd heard right. I said it again. "Will you marry me? I know I should have a ring, and I should get down on one knee, and I should make a whole speech about it, but I can't wait. I need to know right now if you'll marry me, because if you say yes, that's when my life really starts." You closed the book very carefully, set it down on the swing between us, and then you said, "James Callahan, I have been waiting for you to ask me that question since our second date. Of course I'll marry you. Of course I will." We got married 4 months later, December 14th, 1940. The church was cold, but your hand was warm in mine. My hands were shaking so badly the pastor had to help me get the ring on your finger, remember? You whispered, "It's okay, I'm not going anywhere." And you didn't. You stayed, through everything. My mother cried through the entire ceremony. Your father gave you away with tears streaming down his face. Tommy was my best man, and your sister was your maid of honor, and she cried too. Everyone cried except us. We just smiled at each other like we knew a secret the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. At the reception, we danced properly this time. No stepped-on feet. You wore your hair up with little flowers tucked into it, and your wedding dress had belonged to your grandmother, and you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. When we finally left, rice in our hair, shoes tied to the bumper of my father's borrowed car, you fell asleep with your head on my shoulder before we even got home. 16 months we had together before the world went crazy. 16 months of learning how to be married, of figuring out that you liked to read in bed and I liked to fall asleep to the radio, that you were terrible at cooking breakfast, but amazing at dinner, that I could make you laugh by doing impressions of the customers at the store, that you could calm me down when I got frustrated just by putting your hand on my shoulder. 16 months of walking to the corner store for ice cream on Sunday afternoons, of listening to the radio on Friday nights. You loved the music programs, I loved the baseball games, and we compromised. Of you grading papers at the kitchen table while I fixed the leaky sink I'd been promising to fix for weeks. 16 months of ordinary, beautiful life, of waking up next to you every morning and thinking I was the luckiest man alive. Then, December 7th, 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor. And everything changed. I enlisted in January 1942. You knew I would. We didn't even have to discuss it. Every man I knew was enlisting. Tommy went the week after Pearl Harbor. My brother went 2 days after Christmas. The hardware store was emptying out, all the young guys leaving one by one, until it was just my father and the older men trying to keep things running. I remember the morning I told you I was going to the recruiting office. We were having breakfast, eggs and toast, the same thing we had every Tuesday, and I couldn't eat. Just pushed the food around my plate. You watched me for a minute, then put down your fork and said, "You're going today, aren't you?" I nodded. You didn't cry, didn't argue, didn't try to talk me out of it. You just reached across the table and took my hand and said, "Then I'm coming with you." We walked to the recruiting office together. You held my hand the whole way, and we didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. I could feel everything you were thinking in the way you gripped my fingers, the fear, the pride, the love, the dread, all mixed together. When we got there, you kissed me outside, long and hard, like you were trying to memorize what it felt like. Then, you straightened my collar, brushed some imaginary lint off my shoulder, and said, "Go on then. I'll be right here." You waited outside for 2 hours while I filled out paperwork, did the physical exam, swore the oath. When I came out with my acceptance papers, you smiled even though your eyes were red. We walked home a different way. Took the long route past the park where we used to sit, past the diner where we had our first date. Neither of us wanted to get home too fast because once we got home, we'd have to start dealing with what came next. Basic training, deployment, goodbye. I left for training 3 weeks later, January 28th, 1942. I remember the date because it was a Wednesday, and Wednesday was the day you always made pot roast, and you made it that night even though I'd be gone before dinner. For when you come back, you said, I'll make it again, exact same way, and it'll be like you never left. The night before I left, we lay in bed, and you traced patterns on my chest with your finger, the way you always did when you were thinking hard about something but didn't want to say it out loud. Finally, I asked you what you were thinking. You said, I'm memorizing you, just in case. I told you there was no just in case. I told you I'd come home. I promised. And you smiled that sad, brave smile and said, I know, but I'm memorizing you anyway. You traced every scar, every freckle. The crooked way my nose bent from when Tommy and I got in that fight when we were 12. The birthmark on my shoulder. The place where I'd cut my hand on a saw blade at the store, and the scar never quite faded. The next morning, you drove me to the train station. Your hands were steady on the wheel. Your eyes were dry. You'd put on lipstick and your best dress like we were going somewhere nice instead of saying goodbye for God knows how long. At the platform, you straightened my tie even though it didn't need straightening. Fixed my collar even though it was already perfect. Kept your hands busy so they wouldn't shake. When the train whistle blew, you finally looked at me. Really looked at me. Write to me, you said, every chance you get, even if it's just a sentence, even if it's just to say you're okay. Write to me, James. I promised I would. And come home, you said. No matter what, you find a way to come home to me. I promised that too. The train started moving. You walked alongside it for as long as you could, keeping pace, your hand reaching up toward the window where I pressed my palm against the glass. You kept walking until you couldn't keep up anymore, until the platform ended, until I lost sight of you in the crowd. That was 2.5 years ago, Maggie. 2.5 years of missing you so much it physically hurt, of carrying your letters in my pocket until they fell apart, of trying to sleep in mud and cold and noise while dreaming about our quiet bedroom back home. You wrote to me every day. Did you know that made you famous in my unit? The guys called you Saint Margaret because no one else got letters as often as I did. Some of them got letters once a week if they were lucky. Some barely got letters at all. But me, I got one every single day, sometimes 2 if the mail caught up with us. The guys would gather around when mail call happened, and when the sergeant called my name, which he did almost every time, they'd cheer like I'd won something. And I had. I'd won you. You wrote about everything, Maggie. About your students, little Jimmy who finally learned his multiplication tables after 3 months of struggling. Sarah who drew you a picture of a horse that looked more like a dog, but you hung it on the classroom wall anyway because it made her so proud. You wrote about the victory garden you planted in our backyard, how the tomatoes did better than expected, but the carrots were a disaster. How Mrs. Patterson from next door kept trying to give you advice, and how you smiled and nodded even though you knew more about gardening than she did. You wrote about movie nights with your sister, about seeing Casablanca and crying at the end, even though you'd promised yourself you wouldn't, about how the theater was full of women alone or with other women, all of them with someone overseas, all of them pretending to be brave. You wrote about my mother, about how you had dinner with her every Sunday, and how she was teaching you her recipes, about how sometimes she'd start to tell a story about me as a kid, and then she'd stop mid-sentence and just stare at her hands, and you'd reach over and hold them until she was ready to talk again. You wrote about the neighbors, about Mr. Chen who worked at the factory now, making bomber parts, about the Wilson son who came home with one leg missing and how the whole street threw a party for him anyway, because at least he came home. You wrote about gas rationing and food shortages and how you'd gotten creative with what you could buy, about how you and the other teachers had started a savings program at school and the kids were buying war bonds with their lunch money. You wrote about everything and nothing, filling my days with pieces of the life I was fighting to get back to. But you never wrote about being lonely. Never wrote about being scared. Never wrote anything that might make me worry about you when I had enough to worry about already. I knew, though. I could read between the lines. I knew when you wrote 3 pages about your students instead of 1, it was because you were having a hard day and needed to focus on something good. I knew when you signed your letters missing you instead of love always, it was because you were crying too hard to write anything else. There's something I never told you, though. On the worst days, the days when we lost men, when the fighting was so loud I couldn't think, when I was so tired I couldn't remember what peace felt like, I would take out your letters and read them in order. All of them, starting with the first one you sent. It took hours sometimes, but it reminded me that somewhere in the world you were still there, still teaching, still planting gardens, still going to the movies with your sister, still having dinner with my mother, still waiting for me, still believing I'd come home. And that belief, your belief in me, in us, in the future we'd planned, kept me alive more times than you'll ever know. When we were pinned down outside a French village last winter and bullets were tearing up the ground around us and I couldn't see any way we'd make it out, I thought about you. About that pot roast you promised to make when I got home. About how stupid it would be to die before I got to eat your pot roast again. When I got sick with fever in the spring and I was too weak to even lift my head and the medic wasn't sure I'd make it through the night, I thought about you. About how you'd be furious with me if I died from something as boring as a fever. About how you'd probably give me hell about it if you ever saw me again. When Tommy died 3 months ago, and I had to write to his mother, and I couldn't figure out what to say that would make any of it better, I thought about you. About what you'd say if you were there, about how you'd find the right words because you always did. You kept me going, Maggie. When everything else was falling apart, when I couldn't remember why any of this mattered, when I wanted to just give up and let whatever happened happen, you kept me going. Every letter, every word, every reminder that somewhere, someone was waiting for me, believing in me, loving me. You saved my life 100 times and you never even knew it. So here we are, Margaret, June 5th, 1944. I'm sitting in the belly of a ship in the middle of the English Channel, and in a few hours, we're going to storm a beach in France. I can't tell you which beach. I can't tell you the plan. But I can tell you what I'm feeling right now. I'm scared. I've been scared before. Every time we go into action, there's fear. But this feels different, bigger. Like everything is about to change. And not all of us are going to see the other side of it. They've been briefing us for days, showing us maps, models, photographs. They keep saying this is it. This is the big push that's going to change the war, that we're making history. And maybe we are. But right now, all I can think about is you. The guys around me are dealing with it in different ways. Some are sleeping or pretending to. Some are playing cards, even though their hands are shaking. Some are praying. Some are just staring at the ceiling, lost in their own thoughts. Miller keeps making jokes, bad ones. But we laugh anyway because it's better than sitting in silence. Jenkins has been writing to his mother for the past hour, crossing things out, starting over. Rodriguez pulled out a photograph of his wife and won't stop looking at it. And me? I'm writing to you because if these are the last words I ever get to say, I want them to be to you. I'm thinking about the way you hum when you cook, even though you don't realize you're doing it. I'm thinking about how you rid with your finger following the lines, like you're trying to hold on to every word. I'm thinking about Sunday mornings when we'd sleep in late and you'd wake up with your hair all messy and you'd laugh and say you look terrible. But Maggie, you never looked terrible. Not once. Not ever. I'm thinking about how you'd steal my shirts to sleep in because you said they smelled like me, about how you'd put your cold feet on my legs in the middle of the night and I'd complain, but secretly I loved it because it meant you were there, close to me. I'm thinking about how you'd leave little notes in my lunch pail when I went to work. Don't forget to eat your apple, or you're my favorite person, or sometimes just a little heart drawn in pencil. I kept every single one. They're in a box under our bed. Did you know that? I'm thinking about the kids we talked about having. 2, you said. Maybe 3 if the first 2 were easy. You wanted to name our first son after my father and our daughter after your grandmother. You'd already picked out their names, James Jr. and Elizabeth Rose. You'd practiced writing them out sometimes when you thought I wasn't looking. Mrs. Margaret Callahan and her children, James Jr. and Elizabeth Rose, like saying it enough times would make it real. I wanted it to be real too. I wanted those kids. I wanted to see you pregnant, glowing, complaining about your swollen ankles while I rubbed your feet. I wanted to be there for the births, pacing in the waiting room like an idiot. I wanted to hold our babies, watch them grow, teach them how to ride bikes and tie their shoes. I wanted to watch you be a mother, because I knew you'd be wonderful at it, patient and kind and firm when you needed to be. You'd read them stories every night and make up songs and let them stay up late on special occasions. You'd pack their lunches with little notes, just like you did for me. I'm thinking about the house we were going to buy, the one with the big porch and the oak tree in the yard. You said you wanted wind chimes, and I said wind chimes were noisy, and you said that was the point. You wanted our home to sound alive. We drove past it 3 times before I deployed. Remember? It wasn't for sale yet, but you'd heard from someone that the Hendersons were planning to move to be closer to their daughter. You made me stop the car each time, and we'd just sit there looking at it. That's going to be ours, you'd say. When you come home, we're going to buy that house, and we're going to fill it with so much love the whole neighborhood will feel it. I believed you. I still do. I'm thinking about growing old with you, about sitting on that porch in those rocking chairs we joked about, watching our grandkids play in the yard, about you still correcting my grammar when I'm 70, and me still mispronouncing words just to hear you sigh and explain it to me again, about quiet mornings reading the paper together, about holidays with the whole family crowded into our house, loud and chaotic and perfect, about you getting gray hair and insisting you're not old enough for gray hair yet, about me losing my hair and you telling me it makes me look distinguished, about 40, 50 years of ordinary days that add up to an extraordinary life. That's what I'm fighting for, Maggie. Not for glory, not for medals, not because I want to be here, for that porch, for those kids, for 50 more years of you humming in the kitchen and me pretending to be annoyed by your wind chimes, for us, for the life we promised each other. But if something happens tomorrow, if I don't make it back, there are things you need to know, things I need to say while I still can. First, none of this is your fault. Whatever happens in the morning has nothing to do with you or anything you did or didn't do. War doesn't work that way. It's random and cruel, and it doesn't care about love or plans or promises. I'm not going into battle because I have to. I'm going because I chose to. Because when they asked for volunteers, I raised my hand. Because I believe, maybe naively, but I believe, that what we're doing here matters, that we're fighting for something real. But more than that, I'm going so that maybe one day our kids won't have to. So that little James Jr. and Elizabeth Rose can grow up in a world where they don't have to write letters like this to the people they love. That's worth fighting for. You're worth fighting for. Second, you need to keep living, Maggie. Do you hear me? You need to keep teaching those kids and planting those gardens and going to the movies with your sister. You need to keep being you, the woman who makes every room brighter just by walking into it. I know you. I know you'll want to stop, to freeze yourself in this moment and never move forward because moving forward feels like leaving me behind. But Maggie, please don't do that. Live for both of us. Laugh again. Love again, if you can. I mean that. I really mean it. If some other man is smart enough and lucky enough to see what I saw in you, and if he makes you happy, you take that happiness with both hands. You don't apologize for it. You don't feel guilty about it. You don't let anyone, not even my mother, God bless her, make you feel like you're being disloyal. Because here's what I know. Loving you was the greatest privilege of my life. Every single day with you was a gift I didn't deserve, but thanked God for anyway. And if I could go back and choose differently, if I could have a safe, comfortable life without you, or this life, with you and all the pain of leaving you, I'd choose you every single time. You made me better, Maggie. You made me braver and kinder and more human. You made me believe I could be the kind of man worth coming home to. I don't want you to spend the rest of your life waiting for a ghost. I want you to live, really live. Find joy wherever you can. Build a new life, even if it's different from the one we planned. Because the life we had, those 16 months and all the letters since, was perfect. It was enough. It was everything, and nothing that comes after can take that away from us. Third, take care of my parents, my mother especially. She's strong, but losing me will break something in her. She won't show it, but it will. Go see her. Have dinner with her on Sundays like you've been doing. Let her teach you the rest of her recipes. Let her tell you stories about me as a kid, even if you've heard them all before. Let her hold on to you because you're the closest thing she'll have left to me. And my father, he won't talk about it. He'll go to the store every day and work until he's exhausted, so he doesn't have to think about it. But he'll need you too, just in a different way. Fourth, remember me happy, Maggie. Remember me laughing. Remember me the way I was on our wedding day, looking at you like you were the answer to every question I'd ever had. Don't remember me in this uniform. Don't imagine me on some beach somewhere. Don't let the way I died become more important than the way I lived. Remember me dancing with you, even though I was terrible at it. Remember me bringing you flowers for no reason. Remember me falling asleep during your poetry readings and then pretending I'd been listening the whole time. Remember me making breakfast on Saturdays, even though I always burned the toast. Remember me telling you I loved you 100 times a day because I did. Because I do. And remember that you made me happier than I ever thought possible. That every moment with you was a gift. That if I had to do it all over again, knowing how it ends, I wouldn't change a single thing, because loving you was worth everything, even this. Do you remember what I said to you on our wedding day, after the ceremony, when we were alone for just a minute before the reception? We'd snuck away to the side room where they stored the choir robes. You were adjusting your veil in the mirror, and I just stood there watching you, thinking I couldn't possibly get any luckier than this. You caught me staring and smiled. What? You asked. And I told you that I would love you for as long as I lived, that every breath I took would be for you, that you were my beginning and my end and everything in between. You cried then. Happy tears, you said. And you told me that I was stuck with you now, for better or worse, and there was no getting out of it. I kept that promise, Maggie. Right up to the end, if this is the end, right up to this moment, writing to you by flashlight while the sea rocks beneath me and dawn waits just beyond the horizon. You are the last thing on my mind. You will always be the last thing on my mind. There's so much I wish I could tell you. So many ordinary things I took for granted when we were together, thinking we'd have time, thinking there would always be another Sunday morning, another walk to the corner store, another quiet evening listening to the radio. I wish I'd told you more often how much I loved the way you laughed at your own jokes before you even got to the punchline. I wish I'd told you that every time you fell asleep with your head on my shoulder, I'd stay perfectly still even if my arm went numb, because I never wanted that moment to end. I wish I'd told you that when you were grading papers and you'd bite your bottom lip in concentration, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I wish I'd told you that the morning you burned breakfast and cried because you thought you'd ruined everything, I loved you more in that moment than ever before. Because you cared so much about making me happy, even over something as small as eggs. I wish I'd told you that every time I came home from the store and you'd look up from whatever you were doing and smile like you were genuinely happy to see me, even though I'd only been gone a few hours. It made me feel like the most important person in the world. I wish I'd told you that I used to watch you sleep sometimes. Not in a creepy way, I hope, but just looking at you. Peaceful and safe, and mine. Thinking about how impossibly lucky I was that out of everyone in the world, you chose me. I wish I'd told you all of this when I had the chance, when we had time, when forever seemed like something we could count on. But I'm telling you now, in this letter, in these words that I'm writing with a hand that won't stop shaking, on paper that's getting damp from the ocean spray coming through the vents, I'm telling you now because I need you to know. I need you to know that every moment with you was perfect, even the hard moments, even the fights we had about stupid things like whether to put up curtains in the kitchen or what to name the neighbor's cat. All of it was perfect because it was with you. I wish I had better words. I wish I was a poet like those ones you're always reading, Whitman and Dickinson and Frost. I wish I could write something beautiful enough to match what you mean to me. But I'm just me, James. The guy who worked in a hardware store and couldn't dance and stepped on your foot twice and somehow convinced the most incredible woman in the world to marry him anyway. So I'll just say it plain, the way I always have. I love you. I love you more than I have words for. I love you more than all the stars we used to count on summer nights when we'd lie in the grass behind your aunt's house. I love you more than my own life, Maggie. You are my life. And whether I see you again in this world or the next, that love doesn't end. It doesn't stop. It doesn't fade. It's forever. You and me, Maggie. Forever. The light's starting to change outside. I can hear it in the way the guys are moving around, the way the ship sounds different. Dawn is coming. Soon they'll be waking everyone up and we'll eat breakfast, though I doubt anyone will be able to keep it down. And then we'll gear up. And then we'll go. I need to put this letter away soon. Need to seal it, address it, give it to Sergeant Morrison. He promised he'd mail it if I don't make it back to mail it myself. He's a good man. He'll keep his word. But before I do, I want to tell you one more thing. Thank you. Thank you for that dance at the church social when you could have said no to the nervous guy with sweaty palms who forgot his own name. Thank you for saying yes to dinner, and then to another dinner, and another, until I worked up the courage to ask for forever. Thank you for marrying me, even though I'm sure you could have done better, even though your father probably had doubts about whether a hardware store clerk was good enough for his daughter. Thank you for the 16 months we had, for making our tiny apartment feel like home, for teaching me that love isn't just the big moments, the wedding, the promises, the grand gestures. It's also the small ones, the everyday ones, the ones we don't even realize matter until we don't have them anymore. Thank you for writing to me every single day for 2.5 years, for filling my world with words when everything else was noise and chaos. For reminding me why I was here, what I was fighting for, who I was fighting to get back to. Thank you for waiting, for believing, for keeping our life alive in your letters so that even when I was thousands of miles away, I could still feel connected to you, to home, to everything that mattered. Thank you for loving me, Maggie. It was everything. It was enough. It was more than I ever deserved, and I spent every day trying to be worthy of it. I'm going to fold this letter now. Put it in the envelope I've been carrying for 3 weeks, the one that already has your address written on it, because I knew, somehow, that I'd need it. And then I'm going to give it to Morrison, and he'll slip it in his jacket pocket. And if the worst happens, it'll make its way across the ocean to you, to your hands, to your heart, and you'll read these words, and for a little while, I'll be with you again, talking to you the way I always did, telling you I love you the way I never got tired of saying. And then I'm going to pick up my rifle, put on my helmet, and go do what needs to be done. But I'm going with you in my heart. I'm going with your letters in my pocket, the 5 most recent ones, the ones I couldn't leave behind. I'm going with the hope that maybe somehow I'm wrong about all of this, that maybe I'll make it through and this letter will seem overly dramatic and I'll get to come home and you'll tease me about being so serious. God, I hope that's what happens. I hope I'm writing this for nothing. I hope I get to see you again, to hold you again, to make good on all those promises we made to each other. But if I don't, if this is it, then remember that I went into that morning thinking of you, that your name was the last thing on my lips, that my last thought was wondering if you were awake yet, if you were having your morning tea, if you were thinking of me the way I was thinking of you. Remember that I loved you with everything I had. Remember that you were worth it all. Remember that if I could do it over, I wouldn't change a thing. It's time, Maggie. The sergeant just called for everyone to get ready. I have to go now. I love you. I love you. I love you. Always and forever, your James. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Over 156,000 troops landed that day. Nearly 4,500 would not make it home. Private First Class. James Edward Callahan was part of the first wave that hit Omaha Beach at 6:30 in the morning. The ramp dropped, and he went forward with his unit into a hell of gunfire and explosions and screaming that would become the deadliest beach in the invasion. He made it 50 yards from the landing craft before he fell. He was 26 years old. On June 9th, 3 days after the invasion, Margaret Callahan was teaching her third-grade class about fractions when the school secretary knocked on her classroom door. "You have mail," she said gently. "I thought you'd want it right away." Margaret's hands trembled as she took the envelope. She recognized James's handwriting immediately, the familiar loops and slants she'd memorized from hundreds of letters over 2.5 years. She excused herself, let another teacher watch her students, walked down the empty hallway to the bathroom, and locked herself in a stall because she couldn't wait until she got home, couldn't wait another second to hear from him. She opened it carefully, the way she always did, never tearing the envelope, always preserving every piece of him that crossed the ocean to reach her. The letter was longer than usual, thicker. She unfolded it with shaking hands and saw the date at the top. June 5th, 1944. 3 days ago. The first line made her smile through tears she didn't yet know she'd cry. "My dearest Margaret, I'm writing to you from somewhere I can't name, on a night I'll never forget." She read slowly, carefully, drinking in every word. She read about the day they met, about their first dance, his sweaty palms, his nervousness. She laughed, actually laughed out loud in that bathroom stall when he mentioned stepping on her feet. She read about their wedding, about his shaking hands, about the 16 months they had together that felt both endless and far too short. She read about his fear, his honesty, the way he sat on that ship knowing what was coming, knowing what might happen, and chose to write to her anyway. And then she got to the part that broke her. "But if something happens tomorrow, if I don't make it back, there are things you need to know." Her hands started shaking so badly she almost dropped the letter. She read about how it wasn't her fault, how she needed to keep living, how he wanted her to laugh again, love again, not freeze herself in grief. She read his gratitude, his memories, his love repeated over and over like a prayer. She read the last 3 lines, "I love you, I love you, I love you," and something inside her already knew. She folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, walked out of the bathroom with dry eyes because she couldn't let the students see her cry. She taught for the rest of the day, smiled when she needed to, helped students with their work, rang the bell for recess and lunch and dismissal like it was any other day, and then she went home. She walked through the door of the small apartment they'd shared for 16 months, the apartment she'd been living in alone for 2.5 years, set her bag down in its usual spot, took off her shoes, put on the kettle for tea she wouldn't drink, and then she sat at the kitchen table and read the letter again and again. She read it as the sun set outside the window. She read it as night fell and the streetlights came on. She read it until she'd memorized every word, every comma, every place where his pencil had pressed harder when his emotions got stronger. She read it until her eyes burned and her throat ached, and she couldn't cry anymore because she'd already cried everything out. For those hours, between receiving the letter on June 9th and what would come later, Margaret let herself exist in a strange kind of limbo. The letter made James feel alive again, present, right there in the kitchen with her, talking to her the way he always had. She could hear his voice in the words, could picture him sitting on that ship, hunched over with his flashlight, carefully forming each letter. Could imagine his face, serious and focused and full of love. For those hours, he wasn't dead. He was just away, writing to her, telling her he loved her, promising to come home. The telegram came on June 12th, 3 days after she received the letter. She'd been expecting it. Of course she had. You don't get a letter like that, a letter that says goodbye without saying the word, and not know what's coming. but expecting it didn't make it easier. The telegram was brief, impersonal, the way all telegrams were during the war. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your husband, Private First Class James Edward Callahan, was killed in action in defense of his country on the 6th of June, 1944 in France. Letter follows. Killed in action. June 6th, the day after he wrote the letter. The morning he'd been dreading. Margaret didn't cry when she read it. She'd already done her crying. She'd cried for 3 days, reading and rereading his final words, knowing in her bones what they meant, even though she'd been hoping, praying she was wrong. She folded the telegram carefully, put it in a drawer in the kitchen, and closed the drawer. But James's letter, that stayed on the table for 3 more days. Then she moved it to her nightstand, and there it would stay within arm's reach for the rest of her life. The official letter came a week later. More details about the invasion, about how bravely he'd fought, about how he'd been a credit to his country and his unit, about how they were deeply sorry for her loss. They sent his personal effects a month after that, his dog tags, his wedding ring, the 5 letters of hers he'd been carrying in his pocket, stained with salt water and blood but still readable, a photograph of her that he'd kept in his helmet, his Bible with her name written on the inside cover, and they sent his medals, a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star for valor, official recognition that he'd died a hero. Margaret put the medals in a box. She wore his wedding ring on a chain around her neck. She kept the photograph he'd carried, even though seeing it, proof that she'd been with him in his final moments, made her cry every time. But the letter, that letter dated June 5th, 1944, that letter became sacred. Margaret Callahan lived for 62 more years after James died. She continued teaching 3rd grade until she retired at 65. Children who'd been in her classes remembered her decades later as the teacher who really cared, who made learning feel important, who never gave up on anyone. She never remarried. People asked sometimes, well-meaning friends and family who thought she was too young, too beautiful, too full of life to spend it alone. When asked why she stayed single, she would smile, that same gentle smile that had made James fall in love with her, and say, "I already had my great love. Some people don't even get one. I was lucky enough to have James, even if it was only for a little while." She bought the house, the one with the big porch and the oak tree. The Hendersons put it up for sale in 1946, and Margaret used James's life insurance payout and every penny she'd saved to make the down payment. She hung wind chimes on the porch, 3 different sets, all with different tones so the porch always sounded alive. So she could sit there in the rocking chair, just 1, not 2, and close her eyes and remember James complaining about the noise while secretly loving it. She planted a garden every spring, tomatoes mostly. They always did better than the carrots, just like she'd written to him all those years ago. She'd work in that garden for hours, hands in the dirt, talking to James like he was still there, telling him about her day, about the neighborhood, about everything and nothing. She went to the movies with her sister. She traveled, saw places James had talked about visiting someday. She had nieces and nephews who adored her, who called her Aunt Maggie, and spent summers at her house learning to garden and bake and listening to her stories. She had friends. She laughed. She lived a full life, different from the one she'd planned with James, but full nonetheless. But every night before she went to sleep, she would take out that letter. The one dated June 5th, 1944. The one that had crossed an ocean to reach her. The one that had said goodbye without saying the word. And she would read it. Sometimes just a few lines, sometimes the whole thing, sometimes just the part where he said, "I love you," 3 times in a row, because those 3 words, repeated like a prayer, like a promise, like the last thing he needed her to know, never failed to make her feel loved, even decades after he was gone. She kept every letter James ever sent her, tied them with a blue ribbon, the color of his eyes, she always said, and stored them in a wooden box in her closet. 217 letters spanning 2.5 years, a chronicle of a love that was forced to exist on paper because the world was at war. But that last letter, that was different. That one she kept separate, special, sacred. That one stayed on her nightstand in an envelope that had been opened and closed and opened again thousands of times over 6 decades. The paper had gone soft with age and handling. The ink had faded, but never disappeared. The creases had worn thin, but never tore, because she was always so careful with it. Margaret died in 2006 at the age of 88, peacefully in her sleep in the house with the big porch and the oak tree. Her sister found her the next morning. And there, on the nightstand right next to the bed, was the letter, still in its envelope, still precious after all those years. Her family buried her in Riverside Cemetery next to a plot with James's name on it. A cenotaph for a soldier whose body had never made it home from France, but whose name, and the love it represented, had never been forgotten. At the funeral, Margaret's sister read parts of the letter out loud. Not all of it. Some parts were too personal, too intimate, too much just for Margaret. But enough. Enough for everyone there to understand what they'd had, what the war had taken, what Margaret had carried with her for 62 years. She read the part about meeting at the church social, about the yellow dress and the sweaty palms and the stepped-on feet. She read the part about their wedding, about shaking hands and whispered promises. She read the part about keeping living, about not freezing in grief, about taking happiness with both hands. And she read the last 3 lines. I love you, I love you, I love you. There wasn't a dry eye in that church, because everyone there understood what that letter meant, what all those wartime letters meant. They were proof that even in the darkest moments of human history, even in the middle of war and death and destruction, love survived. Love crossed oceans. Love lived in words written by flashlight before dawn. Love endured long after the person who wrote those words was gone. That's the thing about love like James and Margaret had. It doesn't end when someone dies. It doesn't stop at the edge of a battlefield or in a drawer or with a telegram that says, "Killed in action." Real love, the kind that changes you, that makes you better, that gives your life meaning, outlasts everything. It outlasts war. It outlasts death. It outlasts time itself. It lives in letters read by flashlight before dawn, written by a scared young man who wanted his wife to know, one more time, that she was loved. It lives in the heart of a woman who spent 62 years keeping that love alive, honoring it, letting it shape her into someone who loved fully even in the face of devastating loss. It lives in the wind chimes on a porch, ringing out in the summer breeze, making a house sound alive even when the person who wanted them there is long gone. It lives in gardens planted every spring, in tomatoes that always do better than carrots, in small rituals and memories that connect us to the people we've lost. And it lives in that letter, still preserved, still precious, now kept in a museum dedicated to World War II, in a case with James's medals and Margaret's photograph, so that generations who never knew them can read those words and understand what their grandparents and great-grandparents fought for. Not just for freedom, not just for country, for this, for love, for the right to marry the person who makes you laugh, to build a life together, to sit on a porch with wind chimes and grow old together, for all the ordinary magic that war steals from us. Because that's what love is. It's a young man sitting on a ship, writing to his wife before a battle he might not survive. It's a woman receiving that letter and reading it every night for 62 years. It's the promise they made to each other, always and forever. It turned out to be true, even when it broke their hearts, especially then.